Hello there and welcome to the Card Grotto. Today I'm creating a holiday card with hot foiling and a non-traditional colour scheme. So let's get started. I'm using the Hero Arts Wreath and Finch letterpress and foil plate today. These are great because you can use them both for letterpress and also for hot foiling. And I'm going to be doing the hot foiling today. So I'm taking a piece of Hero Arts Amethyst cardstock and a piece of silver Glimmer hot foil, and I'm just cutting the hot foil to size. So I'm kind of moving that wreath plate there, and then I can cut it down with some scissors. I do tend to, I don't want to say waste a bit of foil. The bits that I cut off I am going to keep. I tend to use them for little sentiments and things like that, but I do like to cut my foil quite close to the plate. I find that it helps with any over foiling. So just cutting that down, and my method of hot foiling may be slightly different than a lot of other people's method for hot foiling. I do it like I'm die cutting. So as you can see, I've got the foil there shiny side up, the plate facing downwards, and then I'm holding everything down with some best ever craft tape. I find that this works really well for me. I don't get any shifting of foil or the plates or anything like that, and it will foil exactly where I want it to be on the cardstock. Now in this instance I have cut my cardstock a lot bigger than I know I want it to end up being, because I wasn't 100% certain if I would get this wreath on straight. So that's why I'm opting for the bigger piece of cardstock here. But ordinarily it's a really great way doing hot foiling in this way to be able to get the plate to be exactly where you want it to be. So I'm just doing the same thing here for the little Finch, holding that down with some tape, and then I can bring in my Glimmer hot foil system. So I've let this heat up. The light there says that the platform is ready, so I can flip over my kind of sandwich type thing that I've made here so that the plate is facing downwards onto the platform. I've pressed the timer button, and the timer button will flash while it's heating up that plate. Now some people like to add the shims on top at this point. I personally don't find that I need to, but that is definitely an option that you can do. Now with these plates that are designed to work with letterpress, I do find that I need to heat up my platform twice. So I need to heat up that plate twice. That just personally works for me. I don't do it with like normal foiling plates, but I do it with the ones that are designed to work with the letterpress. Like I said, it just personally works for me. So I've placed my platform back in, and then I've pressed the button to heat that up for a second time. I found that I did need an extra shim, so I've got a piece of printer paper that I folded in half, and then I can add the shims that come with the system on top. I'm now running it through my Platinum 6. And I do tend to run it through fairly slowly. I don't think it particularly matters because I've got everything held down with that tape. It's not going to shift or anything, so I don't necessarily need to do it slowly, but that's just a method I use. And then I put the platform back into the base so that it can heat up while I'm taking the tape off. So I'm being careful here to remove that tape. It doesn't tend to be too sticky or kind of damage the cardstock. I find it helps because it's been heated up, so it is a little bit easier to remove. However, I'm trying to sort of push it back on itself, if that makes sense, so that I don't get any kind of prints of my nails or anything like that into the cardstock, because I'm going to do some ink blending on top, and if I get any kind of marks on the cardstock I think it would show. So I'm using that tape to lift off that plate because it is quite hot at this point. You want to be careful. And I've got a really nice impression with that foil on the purple cardstock. I got a tiny little bit of overfoiling in a couple of areas, but I'll get onto that in a little while. So I've done the exact same thing with the Finch. I have heated up that platform twice. So removed the platform, popped it back in, and did the timer button again, and now I can run that through my Platinum 6. And again I can just carefully remove that piece of cardstock, and then I can lift off that tape and see what I've got underneath. And I do tend to keep my platform on and hot in case I need to redo any foiling. In this case I didn't have to. So again, just being careful to remove that plate, adding those onto the silicone mat for them to cool down. And now I've got my Finch all foiled as well. So it's difficult to see here on camera, but you can just about see that I've got a tiny little bit of overfoiling just around those edges. There are a few different ways that you can get rid of overfoiling. My preferred method is to use a kind of craft knife, and what I do is I kind of place the craft knife on the cardstock, so I'm not actually adding any pressure to it, and just gently kind of scraping away the extra foil. You can use a mono sand eraser and that works really well. I do use that often if I've got a lot of overfoiling, but it does tend to damage the cardstock a little bit. It does kind of take off the top layer of the cardstock if you're not careful, so I tend to go with the craft knife method, especially when I'm doing ink blending on top. And I do also use a Swiffer cloth that I brought in there as well, just to remove the excess bits of foil that I scrape off. I'm now taking the Hero Arts Nesting Rectangle Infinity dies. I'm taking the largest one and placing that over the top of the wreath. I can hold that in place with some low tack tape and run that through my die cutting machine. And now if that wreath wasn't completely straight, hopefully it is now by die cutting it out. I'm placing some removable adhesive onto the back of that and holding that down onto some scrap paper so I can do some ink blending on top. I'm taking Hero Arts Amethyst Core ink and an extra large blending brush, and I'm going around the outside edges of this panel. This ink is the same colour as the cardstock, but because I'm adding a layer on top of the cardstock, it is going to be slightly darker, but as it dries it does fade out a little bit. But I do just want a transition colour between the colour of the cardstock and then the darker inks that I'm going to add on top. So just going around the outside edges, I'm focusing most of the colour maybe sort of towards the corners and then a little bit around the sides as well. I can then go in with Grape Juice. Now this colour is a little bit more on the red toned side rather than the Amethyst, which I think is a little bit more of a blue toned purple. So it is going to warm this panel up a little bit. So again, I'm going around the outsides, mostly around those corner areas. This is a large blending brush, so just a little bit smaller than that extra large one, just because I know that I don't need so much of this ink. I'm then going in with Pitch Black, and I'm just going to darken up that ink blending a little bit. This also is not only going to darken it a little bit, but it's also going to remove a little bit of that red tone from the Grape Juice ink. So again, just kind of going around the outside edges, and then I can take a dry cloth and just remove any excess ink from that foiling. It does tend to resist it, but it does depend on the ink colour, whether it does tend to stain it a little bit or not. So just going around that with my cloth there. And then there are no coordinating dies for these sets, so I'm going to fussy cut this Finch out using scissors. I'm not the best at fussy cutting. I do tend to hold the cardstock quite close to my face so that I can see what I'm doing. So it is a little bit hard for me to share this in a video, but I'm trying my best here to kind of keep the scissors straight and then move the cardstock, and I find that the easiest way to do fussy cutting. So just kind of going around the sort of indentations here on his wings. And then I'm not going to make you endure the whole thing of fussy cutting this out. It did take me a little while. I do tend to take my time with fussy cutting just to try and get the kind of border that I'm leaving to be pretty much the same all the way round. So now I've got my little Finch all cut out, and he's going to perch on the edge of the wreath. So I'm going to work on my sentiment. This is the Hero Arts Cozy Study set. And I'm going to take the sentiment that says Happy Holidays. So I've placed some Hero Arts Pitch Black cardstock inside my mini Misty. I can place the stamp on top, and then close the door of the Mini Misty to pick up that stamp. I'm going to heat emboss the sentiments. I'm going to prep the cardstock with an anti-static powder tool and then remove the excess powder with a brush. I'm then going to ink up the stamp using Hero Art's clear embossing and watermark ink. This is a clear sticky ink so that when I add the embossing powder on top, it's going to stick to it. So just pressing that stamp down onto the cardstock. And then I can apply some Hero Art's white embossing powder, and I do tend to apply this a few times and tap off the excess just to make sure that I get really nice coverage of that powder. Now, in the hope that the anti-static powder tool did its work, I shouldn't have too many stray pieces of embossing powder, but I can remove those with a dry brush if I need to. I'm then bringing in my heat tool, and I like to heat from the front and the back. Generally this helps to prevent warping of the cardstock, but it does also help to make sure that I don't overheat that embossing powder. It does tend to go a little bit grainy if you overheat it, so just being careful there not to overheat that powder and just melt it until it's, or heat it I should say, until it's completely melted. And then move that heat gun away, and then I'm just going to cool it down and then remove any of that anti-static powder with a cloth. I'm then taking the coordinating die, placing it on top and holding it down with some low tack tape, and then I can run that through my die cutting machine. And just for a little bit of extra stability, I am going to cut the die again. I am popping this up with foam tape, but I still quite like to often do 2 layers of a sentiment. So bringing in some liquid glue here. This is Hero Art's Precision XL glue, and mine is on the kind of what's the word? It's very loose. I'm trying to think of the word here and I can't think of it, but you know what I mean. So I'm just removing any excess glue there onto some scrap paper and then popping the embossed one on top. I can now add some tape runner adhesive onto the back of my foiled panel. And then I can adhere that down onto an A2 size card base that's cut from the same Amethyst cardstock. And you can see here the difference between what the colour of the cardstock was initially, and now with that ink blending on top it's quite a lot darker. I'm then bringing it in my bone folder just to go around the outside edges to make sure that that's really well stuck down. I'm then taking some black twine and I'm going to tie that in a bow. I thought it would look quite nice to have the Finch on top of something so that he didn't just kind of blend into the foiling on the wreath. So I thought I would do that with a bow. So I've got my twine here that I've tied in a bow and I'm just kind of manipulating it slightly. Ordinarily when I make bows I tend to have one tail upwards and one tail downwards, so this time I'm trying to have them both downwards, but I want the twine to kind of flick out on either side, and I was struggling a little bit with doing this, especially this one here on the left hand side. So I've now got my Finch. I'm going to add some foam tape onto the back of him, but I don't want to add foam tape into the center because that's where the kind of knot of the bow is going to be, and I didn't want to add too much bulk onto this card. So I'm going to have the foam tape not be in the center and have that kind of there with the knot of the bow. So I can just remove the backings off of that foam tape, and then I can bring in the bow and then pop the Finch on top of the bow. And that foam tape is just going to hold that twine in place. So again, just trying to sort of fiddle with that tail a little bit, just checking here that that's going to hold. And then I can turn that over and then I can adhere that down onto the card. And I'm just going to pop it down so that he's kind of perching on the edge of the wreath. So just hovering him in place, and then once I'm happy with the placement I can press him down. And I'm still fiddling with that tail there, trying to manipulate that twine how I want it to be. You can definitely add a little bit of glue onto the twine and let it dry, and then it will kind of as it dries it will stay in place, but I didn't really want to do that, so I'm just bringing in a glass block to hold that down. I'm then adding some thin foam tape onto the back of the sentiment. I can remove the backings off of that foam tape, and then using my T-square ruler for placement I can pop that down onto the card. I then wanted to bring in the black colour a little bit more. This is definitely a non-traditional kind of holiday colour scheme. It probably is kind of more towards the Halloween side rather than like a Christmas card, but I do really like how it turned out. It's something a little bit different, I suppose, and I really love purple, black and silver together, so I thought that I would add some of these tiny little Hero Hues enamel dots around where the kind of berries are on the wreath. So just picking those up with a pokey tool and placing those down where the berries are. Got another one down there and then another one there towards the left hand side, and then there is one missing at the top there. Initially I thought that I would add one there, but I was just kind of counting them up here at this point and realised that there were 7, and I do prefer embellishments in odd numbers, so I decided to leave that one at the top without an enamel dot on it, and I think it looks quite nice. I think they're quite sort of spread out. And so that's the card finished for today. Very non-traditional in terms of colour scheme, but I do think it's really pretty. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on my blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.